Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Let's start with a question. A breath that begins automatically every 5 seconds due to ventilator settings is, so because we set the time, then this is going to be time triggered. So let's see why. So we started our conversation about mechanical ventilation. So we did ventilator 101. And then today we're going to be going to ventilator 102. And then if you have not watched the previous video that we did on Vent 101, I would strongly encourage you to watch that video, because what we're going to be talking about today is going to be a build on what we've discussed in the past. So for Vent 102, today we're going to be focusing on 4 phases of mechanical ventilation. So what are these 4 phases? So we have the trigger, the target, the cycle, and the baseline. So let's see what this means. So we're going to start with trigger. So what's trigger? So trigger is the phase that starts inspiration. So the trigger determines how a breath is initiated. So trigger is what's going to initiate, is what initiates the breath. So when we look at different types of triggers that we have, so we have the patient triggered and we have the ventilator triggered. So let's start with patient triggered. So for patient triggered, it could be a pressure trigger or a flow trigger. So what does that mean? So that means when the patient is trying to initiate a breath, then that will lead to a changes in the pressure in the airway. And then the ventilator will sense that and realize that the patient wants to take a breath, and then is going to deliver the breath to the patient. And if it's also flow, when the patient wants to initiate a breath, then there's going to be a change in flow in the airway. And the ventilator is going to sense that, oh, the patient wants to take a breath, and it is going to deliver a breath to the patient. And this flow trigger is more sensitive than pressure trigger. So because the patient is the one that is initiating it and the ventilator is only just assisting, then we're going to call this assisted breath, right? Assisted breath. So moving on to ventilator trigger. So for ventilator trigger, this is a time trigger. So that means inspiration will begins after a set respiratory rate interval. And because this one is time triggered, you set the rate, then we're going to call this a controlled breath. So it's going to be a controlled breath. For instance, if you set the respiratory rate at, or mechanical rate, let's say you set it at 10, right? So that means 60 seconds divided by 10, because in 1 minute we have 60 seconds. So 60 divided by 10, that will be 6. So that means every 6 seconds, right, the ventilator is going to deliver breath to the patient. So moving on to the next one, which is targets and limits, right? So what's target? So target is how breath is delivered during inspiration. Remember, trigger is what initiates it. Then how that breath is being delivered is what we call trigger. And whichever trigger that you use, right, that's going to be a variable control. So that means that to be a controlled variable during inspiration. And what are the possible target variables that we have? So we have pressure targeted ventilation, and we have flow targeted ventilation. And of course, flow is volume over time. So sometimes in some tests, instead of saying flow targeted, sometimes they use the word volume targeted ventilation. So they're still talking about the same thing. So let's start with pressure targeted ventilation. So this is same classic in things like pressure control, pressure support, right? So when you look at the pressure is fixed. So when you look at the waveform of the pressure, you're going to see the wave looks fixed and very smooth, right? So that means if you are controlling the pressure, right? So what are we not controlling? We are not controlling the volume. So the volume become variable, right? So that means when you look at the waveform of the volume, it can change from breath to breath, right? Depending on the patient's lung mechanism, right? As opposed to flow targeted ventilation or volume targeted ventilation. So this example of this one is volume control, right? So that means the ventilator is going to deliver a set volume, right? So which is what we call tidal volume. So to deliver a set tidal volume, so the tidal volume that you set to the ventilator. And the way you're going to know that this is actually a control, a volume control, is when you look at the waveform of the volume, the waveform is going to be fixed and also smooth, right? So now that the volume is the controlled variable, then what's not controlled? So that means your pressure is going to vary. So the pressure could change from one breath to another breath, right? Depending on the patient's lung mechanism. So the next thing there under here is limit. So what's limit? So limit is the safety setting that prevents a variable control. So remember we just talked about the variable control, which will either be pressure or flow, from exceeding the maximum value and hence protecting the lung. So this is what you set so that you don't want any damages to the lung. A classic example is what we see in PRVC, which is pressure regulated volume control, whereby you set a tidal volume, right? For instance, like let's say tidal volume of 500. So if you set that tidal volume, that's going to be your target, yeah, because that's how the volume is going to be, that's how the breath is going to be delivered, right? And then once that tidal volume is being delivered, then you also have a safety setting in place to make sure that when that tidal volume is being delivered, the pressure doesn't go too high. So you put a maximum pressure here of 30 in this case. So this maximum pressure of 30 is going to now be the limit of that. So if the ventilator is delivering the breath, which is going to be tidal volume in this case, and if that pressure is being reached, then that will limit further delivering of breath, right? So moving on to the next phase, which is going to be cycle, right? So what's cycle? So this is the phase that ends inspiration. So cycle is the phase that ends inspiration. So cycle determines what variable terminates inspiration and starts expiration. So what are different type of cycling that we have? So we have volume cycled, we have time cycled, pressure cycled, and flow cycled. So let's start with volume cycled. So that means the inspiration will end when a set volume is being delivered. So once that set volume is being delivered, then inspiration ends. Whereby time cycle means it ends after a set time, the time that you set, right? And a pressure cycle, that means it ends when a pressure limit is reached, like what we just talked about earlier, whereby once that maximum pressure is reached, then the breath stop, right? And the last one there is flow cycle, which means it ends when the flow falls to a certain percentage. So if the flow falls to a certain percentage, then the breath stop, right? And this flow cycle is what we use classically in pressure support and ventilation. So pressure support ventilation, which we're going to talk about later, uses flow cycle. So when we look at the most common, so in volume control use volume cycle, pressure control use time cycling, and pressure support, like we mentioned earlier, use flow cycling, right? And the last thing we're going to talk about is baseline, right? So baseline. So this is variable that is controlled during expiration. So baseline is expiration, because everything we've talked about so far, those are inspiration, but baseline is expiration. So baseline variable is usually what the ventilator maintains during the expiratory phase, right? And this is the airway pressure during expiration. And our common baseline would be the PEEP, right? We spoke about PEEP the other day, the positive end expiratory pressure, which is the pressure in the lungs at the end of during expiration, right? So that's going to be the pressure in the lung at the end of the expiratory phase, right? So that's what we call PEEP. And then this PEEP is what keeps the alveolar open, also help to improve surface area, thereby improving oxygenation and prevents atelectasis, right? So the baseline equals to the end expiratory control. And remember, this is not the same thing as trigger. It's not the same thing as what starts the inspiration, which is what we spoke about earlier. So let's look at, let's kind of like put everything we discussed into an example. So for instance, let's look at this flow diagram, right? So let's say this is the baseline. So anything up here will be inspiration, and then this is going to be expiration. And here, so let's say the ventilator in this case is delivering a breath, right? So it's going to be our baseline. So let's look at this diagram. So looking at here, so here, right here, right? Remember, that's when, so everything up above this baseline will be inspiration, and then below here is going to be expiration. So starting from this point, so that's going to be our trigger, right? So that's to be the trigger. And then when you look at this trigger, so this is going to be an example of vent trigger, right? And as I mentioned earlier, vent trigger is usually what? Time. So based on your set respiratory rate. And if you compare this trigger to this second trigger, we can see that there is a negative deflection here before the breath is being delivered. So this negative deflection that I see here tells me that the patient is the patient that is initiating the breath, right? So this is going to be, so this is another trigger here, and this is going to be a patient trigger. And like we said, patient trigger could be maybe because of changes in the airway pressure or changes in the flow, right? So because this one is patient trigger, we're going to call it what? Assisted. It's going to be an assisted what? Breath. And then because this one is ventilator, right? Trigger, then that to be what? A controlled breath, right? So now let's see. So the next one will be the target, right? Down to be target. So looking at this, so going to be a flow target, right? Which we also same thing as volume. Remember, flow targets of flow target is going to be how the breath is being delivered. So this is going to be an example whereby you have a set tidal volume that is being what? That is being delivered, right? And so what's going to be variable here will be what? What varies is going to be very good, the pressure. So the pressure is going to be what? It's going to vary based on from one breath to another breath, and depending on the patient's lung mechanism. And of course, this is also going to be our target here, and which is also going to be flow. Right? And moving on to the next one, which is going to be cycle. And what cycle again? Very good. What ends the breath? So in this case is volume cycling. So meaning that once you deliver our set tidal volume, then what happens? Then it stops, right? So once that set tidal volume is delivered, then the breath what? Stops, right? And of course, we're back to what? We're back to baseline, right? So we've come to the end of today's lecture. So let's do some questions together. Which of the following is an example of patient-triggered breath? Right? So patient-triggered. So what do you guys think? Very good. So breath delivered when the ventilator detects a flow change caused by the patient effort. So that would be a patient-triggered breath. In volume control ventilation, the target variable is, what do you guys think? So in volume control, what are you targeting? Remember, target is what? How the breath is being delivered. Very good. So the answer there will be volume, which is also flow, right? Remember, I said that flow is volume over time. Moving on to the next question. Pressure support ventilation, hence inspiration based on, what do you guys think? Very good. Remember, we said that drop in inspiratory flow below a set percentage. That's when that breath is going to what? Stop. And then moving on to the last question. Which breath cycle mechanism ends inspiration when a preset tidal volume has been delivered? So you have a preset tidal volume. So here we're asking for what's going to end remember we said that cycle is what ends the inspiration, right? But in this case, after a set tidal volume has been delivered. So this is going to be a what? Very good. This is going to be a volume cycling because this is a volume control mode based on, because you have a preset tidal volume. You set the tidal volume, so that's going to be a volume control. So this is going to be a volume cycling. So once that set tidal volume has been delivered, then the inspiration is going to stop. Thank you guys for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe, share with your friends, and follow us on our social media platform. And I will see you guys in the next lecture.